In the winter of 1914, a German philologist working in the basement of the University of Pennsylvania Museum published his translation of a broken tablet pulled from the ruins of Nippur. The fragment described the Great Flood in language older than any version known before it. Buried in its lines was a detail no one discussed. The tablet did not describe the flood as a punishment. It described the flood as an operation, planned beforehand with one purpose above all others, to make certain that something survived. What that something was is not what any of us have been told. The story of how the oldest flood account on Earth came to be read begins not in Mesopotamia, but in a workroom of the British Museum in the autumn of 1872, where a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith was sorting through crates of broken tablets shipped from the ruins of Nineveh. Smith had been a banknote engraver before he taught himself cuneiform, and the museum had hired him for his eyes, which could pick meaning out of clay that other men saw only as damage. On the 2nd of December of that year, Smith read aloud to the Society of Biblical Archaeology from a tablet that described a great ship, a great rain, and a bird sent out over the waters to find dry land. The account was recognisably the flood. It had been written down by the most conservative estimates 1,000 years before the book of Genesis. The lecture made Smith famous, and it made the tablet famous, and it fixed in the public mind a single idea that has never fully been dislodged, that the Mesopotamian flood story was an earlier draft of the story we already knew, a story of divine anger, a story of punishment, a story of destruction. But the tablet Smith read was not the oldest version. It was a late copy written in Akkadian for the library of an Assyrian king, and it was broken in precisely the places where the older tradition had the most to say. The older tradition lay elsewhere, in the ruins of the Sumerian city of Nippur, where between 1889 and 1900 an expedition from the University of Pennsylvania pulled some 30,000 tablets and fragments out of the ground and shipped a large portion of them to Philadelphia. Most of the fragments were administrative. Inventories of grain, receipts for sheep, the endless bookkeeping of temple economies. The pieces that were not administrative were sorted, numbered, and set into drawers to wait for someone with the time and the training to read them. One of those pieces, a lower third of a tablet catalogued as CBS 10673, waited until a German-born philologist named Arno Poebel sat down with it in 1912. Poebel published his translation in 1914, and what he had found was the text that scholars now call the Eridu Genesis, the oldest connected account of the flood that survives in any language. It is written in Sumerian, not Akkadian. It names the flood hero not as Utnapishtim, as the Nineveh tablet does, but as Yusudra, king of Shuruppak, a name that means something close to he who saw life of long days. And it differs from the later versions in a way that Poebel noted, recorded, and then, in the manner of careful scholars, declined to pursue. The later versions dwell on the anger of the gods. The Sumerian fragment dwells on something else. It dwells on the preparations. The surviving lines give more space to what must be done before the water comes than to the water itself, and they describe those preparations in the flat, itemized voice that Sumerian scribes otherwise reserved for cargo manifests and temple inventories. There is a phrase in the broader tradition surrounding this text, preserved across the flood tablets and the commentaries that grew around them, that Poebel's successors translated in various ways and agreed on in none. The phrase is a Sumerian compound that can be rendered with hesitation as the nig-dirig, the carried through things. Not the saved things, not the spared things, the carried through things, as though the flood were not a wall that certain objects happened to survive, but a passage that certain objects were deliberately sent into, with the full expectation that they would emerge on the other side. The standard scholarly treatments file this language under formula. Stock phrasing, the commentaries say, a scribal convention. The tablets themselves do not treat it as convention. The tablets treat it as a list. We will return to that phrase because it matters a great deal more than it sounds. Before we go further into what the tablets say was carried through, take a moment now and tap that subscribe button. The translations you are about to hear have spent a century dispersed across excavation reports, museum accession ledgers, and journal articles that almost no one outside a handful of departments has ever read. The only way more of these forgotten texts reach the surface is if channels like this one keep growing. Tap subscribe, turn the notifications on, and let us continue. What makes the Nippur fragment difficult to dismiss is the company it keeps. The Eridu Genesis does not stand alone. It stands at the head of a family of texts that includes the Atrahasis epic, composed in Akkadian in the centuries around 1700 before the Common Era, and the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the very text Smith read in London. These versions disagree about names, they disagree about the number of days the storm lasted. They disagree about which god said what in the Council of Heaven, but they agree with a consistency that the scribes themselves seem to have protected about the sequence of the preparations. In every surviving version, a god who dissents from the decision breaks rank and delivers a warning. In every surviving version, the warning comes with instructions, and in every surviving version, the instructions are not simply build a boat and get inside. The instructions specify what must be brought aboard, and the specification is detailed, deliberate, and strange. Poebel, by all available accounts, understood that the specification was the heart of the text. A colleague at Philadelphia would later recall that he kept a typed list of the manifest lines pinned above his desk for the better part of a year. He never published a word about what he thought the list meant. His 1914 volume presents the translation, notes the parallels, and stops at the edge of interpretation the way a man stops at the edge of deep water. The fragment went back into its drawer. The field moved on to other cities and other wars. And the question that the oldest flood text on Earth quietly raises, the question of why a story about the end of the world spends its best lines on packing instructions, was left standing open, unanswered and largely unasked for the next 100 years. The tablet is still in Philadelphia. The lower third is still all we have. The phrase is still there in the tradition, waiting, the carried through things, written by men who chose their words the way they weighed their grain exactly and with intent, and who do not appear to have believed that anything about the list was formula at all. What the tablets describe when the surviving versions are laid side by side is a decision taken in council. The Atrahasis epic gives the fullest account. The gods, it says, had grown weary of mankind. The text gives the reason in a word that translators have rendered as noise or clamour or din, the rigmu, the sound of humanity rising into the dwelling places of the gods and making rest impossible. Enlil, the chief of the assembly, proposed remedies in sequence. A plague was sent and mankind recovered. A drought was sent and mankind recovered. A famine was sent and the texts record its progress in intervals of years with the same dispassion a physician records the progress of a fever. And when each of these measures had failed, Enlil proposed the final measure, the abubu, the flood, and he bound the assembly by oath to tell no human being that it was coming. One god took the oath and then broke it without breaking it. The texts are careful here, and the care is the point. Enki, the god of the deep waters and of craft, the god the Sumerians credited with the arts of civilization itself, went to the house of a man he favoured, and he did not speak to the man. He spoke to the wall. The tablet records his words, "Wall, listen to me, read hut an, attend." And through the wall, to the man sleeping behind it, Enki delivered the warning and the instructions, and could stand afterward in the assembly of the gods and say, with the precision of a lawyer, that he had revealed the secret to no man. The man behind the wall was Ziusudra in the Sumerian telling, Atrahasis in the Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the version read aloud in London in 1872. 3 names, the scholars agree, for the same remembered figure. It is at this point that the texts do something that the summaries and the retellings have almost universally smoothed over. They slow down. The storm, when it finally comes, is dispatched in a handful of lines, 7 days in one version, a passage of dark and wind and the gods themselves recoiling from what they had unleashed. But the instructions, the preparations, the specifications of the vessel and its contents receive line after line after line, in the itemized cadence of men recording freight, The dimensions are given, the decks are counted. The Gilgamesh version specifies the pitch, the bitumen, the quantities of oil dispensed to the workmen, even the slaughtered oxen and the beer provided to the labour crews, as though the scribe were copying from a foreman's ledger. The boat in that version is not even shaped like a boat. Its floor plan is a perfect square, an acre in area, its height equal to its width, a cube, a form that no shipwright in the history of water would choose for a vessel meant to sail. It was not meant to sail, it was meant to hold. The texts describe a container, and then the texts describe the cargo. The command in the Gilgamesh tablet survives in full, and it is worth hearing in something close to its own order. Abandon wealth, the god says, abandon possessions, and load into the vessel the seed of all living things. The phrase is not decorative. It recurs in variant forms across the tradition, the seed of life, the seed of mankind, the seed of the beasts of the field. And the scribes deploy the word for seed, the numun, with the same concreteness they used in agricultural accounts, where it meant the literal stock from which next year's harvest would be raised. The Atrahasis version extends the list. The clean animals and the fat animals, the birds of the heavens, the craftsmen, in some readings of a damaged line, the carriers of skills. Zeus Sudra's version, in the fragment from Nippur, it's broken exactly where the manifest would stand, but the lines that survive around the break speak of the preservation, this is the scribe's own framing, of the name of the small animals and the seed of mankind. Preservation, the word is in the text. Read in sequence, the operation acquires a shape that the destruction narrative cannot account for. Decision is taken in council to erase. A member of that council, the one associated above all others with knowledge and craft, arranges a countermeasure. The countermeasure is not a rescue in any ordinary sense, because a rescue saves what happens to be at hand, and this vessel was loaded against a list. Dimensions calculated, cargo specified, categories enumerated, seed, stock, craft, kind by kind. The later tradition even preserves, in the writings of a Babylonian priest named Berossus, composed in Greek in the 3rd century before the Common Era, a further instruction that appears in no surviving tablet, but that Berossus insists stood in the records of his temple. That before the waters came, the writings, all of them, the tablets of the things that had been learned, were to be buried in the earth at the city of Sippar, the city of the sun god, so that when the waters withdrew, they could be dug up again and given back to mankind. Buried before, recovered after. That is not the behaviour of a civilization caught by catastrophe. That is the behaviour of a civilization preparing a transmission. We are accustomed to reading the flood as an ending that one family escaped. The oldest texts, read on their own terms, describe something closer to the opposite. The ending was general, but it was also, in the strict sense, a cover. Beneath the announced operation, the erasure, ran a second operation, quieter, more precise and evidently more important to the god who conducted it. An operation whose entire purpose was that certain things should pass through the water untouched and arrive on the far side of the disaster intact. The nig-dirig, the carried through things, the texts have preserved the manifest in fragments. A phrase here, a broken line there, a priest's late testimony about buried writings. What the tablets ask us to consider is that the flood succeeded, and that it succeeded twice. The old world went under the water exactly as the assembly had decreed, and the cargo came through, exactly as the god of craft had planned, and was unloaded onto the mud of a new world, and was distributed and took root. What that cargo contained, item by item, is what the oldest surviving records of the human race spend their most careful lines trying to tell us. The scribes wrote the list down. Parts of it can still be read. When the surviving fragments of the manifest are gathered and set in order, they resolve into 5 categories, 5 kinds of cargo that the tradition insists were carried through the water. The scribes did not number them, but the texts return to them again and again, and the pattern holds across 1,000 years of copying. The first of the carried through things was knowledge itself. The testimony here comes from Berossus, the Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 before the Common Era, who claimed access to temple records reaching back before the flood. Berossus states that the flood hero was commanded to bury the writings, the whole of them, at Sippar before the waters came, and that the survivors were commanded afterward to return to Sippar, dig, and recover them. This is testimony, not proof, and it should be marked as such. But it carries one detail that has drawn the attention of archaeologists ever since. Sippar is a real place. It was excavated in the 1880s and again in the 20th century, and it yielded one of the largest tablet libraries ever recovered from the ancient world. Tens of thousands of texts, including copies of works the scribes themselves labelled as belonging to the time before the flood. The library is fact. The pre-flood burial is interpretation. The texts hold the two together and let them touch. The second of the carried through things was kingship. The evidence here sits in one of the most studied documents of the ancient Near East, the Sumerian king list, of which more than a dozen copies survive. The list records the reigns of kings before the flood in impossible spans, tens of thousands of years, and then it pauses and it sets down a single line that scholars have read for a century without agreeing on its weight. The flood swept over, the line says. And after the flood swept over, kingship was lowered again from heaven. Again. The word is in the text. Kingship, in the scribe's understanding, was not a human invention that had to be rebuilt from nothing. It was an institution, a thing that existed apart from the men who held it, that had been lowered once, withdrawn or preserved through the water, and lowered a second time. First, the list says, at the city of Kish. Whatever kingship was to these scribes, it was on the manifest. The third of the carried through things was seed, in the plainest agricultural sense. The numen, the stock of plants and animals from which a world could be resown. The command to load the seed of all living things stands in the Gilgamesh tablet in exactly those words, and the Atrahasis and Eridu Genesis fragments carry variant forms of the same instruction. And it is here that the Mesopotamian record stops being alone. The flood traditions of other civilizations, gathered by folklorists in their hundreds from India, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, the Pacific, disagree about almost everything: the hero's name, the water's cause, the mountain of landing. What a striking number of them agree about is the cargo: seeds carried in a gourd, animals taken in pairs, a brother and sister sealed in a drum with the grain. The stories remember a preservation of stock. Whether they remember one event or many, whether they descend from a common source or converge on a common logic, is a question the evidence cannot yet close. The pattern itself is simply there, on every inhabited continent, and it deserves to be said plainly. The fourth of the carried through things was craft, the skills by which civilization operates. The Mesopotamian tradition personified this knowledge in the Apkallu, the 7 sages, being sent before the flood to teach mankind the arts: writing, building, irrigation, law, the working of metals. The tablets state that the sages belonged to the time before the water, and that after the water their knowledge continued, transmitted now through human masters, the Ummanu, the scholars who served the post-flood kings and who traced their lineages in surviving lists directly back to the 7. One late tablet from Uruk sets out the genealogy in 2 columns, sage beside king, before the flood and after, an unbroken chain of instruction across the disaster. The Atrahasis fragments, in a damaged passage, appear to place craftsmen aboard the vessel itself. The reading is contested. The claim of continuity is not. The scribes believe the skills came through. And the 5th of the carried through things was the line of the survivor himself. Here the texts are at their most careful. Ziusudra is not simply spared. After the waters withdraw, the Eridu Genesis says, the gods grant him life like a god, breath eternal, and they settle him apart from mankind, in a place the tablet calls Dilmun, the land of crossing, at the mouth of the rivers. He is removed, the way an original document is removed from circulation once the copies are made. His descendants people the new world. His person, the template, is kept. The Gilgamesh epic is built on exactly this understanding. Its hero travels to the ends of the earth to find the preserved man, because the preserved man is still there to be found. Set the 5 side by side and the shape is difficult to unsee. Knowledge, buried and recovered. Kingship, withdrawn and lowered again. Seed, loaded by category. Craft, transmitted across the break. Blood, the proven line, set apart and maintained. This is not the salvage of a catastrophe, this is redundancy. Each category preserved by a different method, writings in the earth, institutions in heaven, stock in the vessel, skills in the sages, lineage in a guarded man, so that the failure of any one channel would not break the transmission. Modern civilization builds such systems and calls them backups. The scribes of Nippur described one 4,000 years ago in the calm voice they used for all serious matters, and modern science has, without intending to, supplied the setting. At the end of the last ice age, in the interval geologists call the Younger Dryas, roughly 12,900 to 11,600 years ago, the melting of the great ice sheets raised the oceans by more than 100 metres, drowning coastlines and river plains worldwide, including the shallow basin at the head of the Persian Gulf where the oldest Sumerian cities would later stand. That the waters rose is measured fact, that anyone planned for them is interpretation. But in southeastern Turkey, at a hilltop site called Göbekli Tepe, excavators have uncovered massive carved stone enclosures raised at exactly that time by people who were not supposed to be capable of raising them, and then, centuries later, deliberately buried, filled in by hand, entombed, preserved under the soil until 1994. Someone, at the edge of that drowned world, was already burying things on purpose so they would last. If the manifest was real, the cargo should be traceable. And the strange thing, the thing that the standard histories record without ever quite assembling, is that it is. The trail begins where Berossus said to dig. Sippar, when excavators opened it in the 1880s under Hormuzd Rassam, and again in later campaigns, gave up its tablets in the tens of thousands. And among them were texts whose own colophons, the scribal signatures at their ends, describe them as copies of writings from before the flood. The scribes of the first millennium believed they were curating an inherited library. They said so in their own hands, at the bottoms of their own tablets. Whether the originals ever lay in the ground through a deluge is beyond proof. That the tradition of a recovered pre-flood archive was maintained, copied and treated as fact by the very institution Berossus served is simply the record. The trail continues in the king list, which does not end at the flood. It resumes. After the flood swept over, kingship was lowered again from heaven, and the kingship was at Kish, and Kish is real, and has been excavated, and is among the oldest cities of the plain, and the earliest kings the list names after the water begin at a certain depth in the sequence, to correspond to men whose inscriptions archaeologists have actually found. The list, in other words, runs continuously from myth into verifiable history without marking any seam. The scribes who kept it saw no seam. To them, the institution that governed their world was itself an artifact from the other side of the water, part of the cargo still in use. The trail continues in the sage lists of Uruk, where the lineages of the scholars serving historical kings, kings we can date, kings whose palaces we have walked through, are traced back, name by name, across the flood to the 7 Apkallu. The men who compiled those lists were the astronomers and physicians and lawyers of their age, the technical class of the ancient world. They understood their own expertise as an inheritance carried through the water, and they kept the chain of custody in writing. And here the academic record does something worth noticing. It preserves all of this, publishes all of this, and declines, almost without exception, to weigh it. Poebel translated the preservation language in 1914 and stopped at the edge. The great mid-century treatments of the flood texts, Lambert and Millard's edition of Atrahasis in 1969 among them, note the manifest passages, mark the burial tradition in Berossus, and file the pattern under literary convention. The word that recurs in the footnotes is formulaic. It is the scholarly equivalent of the accession ledgers defer to senior staff. The pattern is not denied, it is simply never asked what it means. The preservation reading of the flood has lived for a century where such readings live, in the footnotes, in the private letters, in the questions raised at conferences and not pursued, while the destruction reading, the one Smith announced in London in 1872, went on to become the only version most of the world has ever heard. But consider what the tablets are actually asking us to accept, because it is stranger and quieter than any catastrophe. They are asking us to accept that we have the story upside down. We tell the flood as the near death of the world, a disaster that a remnant barely escaped, and we count ourselves the descendants of the escape. The tablets describe something else. They describe a shipment. A world was ending by decree or by ice or by water. The texts and the geology agree at least on the water, and inside that ending someone packed. Knowledge into the ground at Sippar. Kingship into withdrawal and return, seed into the hold kind by kind. Craft into 7 remembered teachers, blood into 1 guarded line. And when the water withdrew, the cargo was unloaded and distributed, and the distribution took root and grew, and the thing it grew into kept the receipts, copied them for 4,000 years, and called them literature. On this reading, we are not the survivors of the flood. We are its deliverables. The cities, the writing, the law, the sciences, the institutions of rule, all of it, in the scribe's own understanding, came through the water on purpose. We do not live after the old world. We live inside what was saved from it. That is interpretation, and it should be held the way Ashworth's successors in every archive have learned to hold such things, provisionally at arm's length, against the evidence. But the evidence itself does not go away. The tablets exist. CBS 10673 is in Philadelphia now. In the collections of the Penn Museum, its lower third still all that was ever found. The kingless copies are in Oxford and Berlin. The Sippar libraries are in Baghdad and London. The colophons say what they say. And at Göbekli Tepe the enclosures are still coming out of the soil that was piled over them, deliberately, by hands that wanted them to last, at the very edge of the era when the seas rose over the old coastlines of the world. So consider tonight an observation that requires no belief at all. Look at the oldest things your own life touches, the grain in your bread forward season by season from stock first selected at the end of the ice. The letters on this screen descended through Rome and Greece and Phoenicia, from marks first pressed into river clay. The week you live by, the hour, the contract, the city. Every one of them is older than any nation that now exists, and every one of them crossed some disaster that should have ended it and did not, because someone, somewhere, made sure it was carried. Ask yourself honestly whether the things around you are simply old or whether you are living among cargo, surrounded by the contents of a delivery that was planned before the water came and has never stopped arriving. The scribes of Nippur wrote the list down in the calm voice they used for all serious matters. They did not argue, they recorded. The flood swept over, they wrote, and kingship was lowered again from heaven, and the writings were taken up out of the earth at Sippar, and the seed was brought out of the boat, and the world was planted. The nig-dirig, the carried through things. 4,000 years later the water is long gone, and the tablets are in drawers, and the carried through things are everywhere, still in use, still in our hands. The old world did not entirely die. It was mailed to us. And what the gods chose to save is not what any of us have been told. It is what we are.